Oh, hey. Hi. Sorry, just getting a little liquid courage there. Welcome to the kitchen. We're here to talk about sourdough. Since it's April 2020, we're stuck inside and have an exceptional amount of time on our hands to bake or do new projects. And a couple of our friends have contacted us recently asking questions about sourdough, so we decided Lisa and I would put our heads together to try to give you more than just the ingredients, of which there are only 3, but rather some details that you might not know about unless you were in here in the kitchen at the time we were doing it. As you can see, it is the beginning of the universe, 2 minutes on the clock. So that's a sort of a timer that will run for 24 hours. So we're going to cut away and come back a bunch of times, and you'll be able to see sort of where we are in the process, which hopefully will be helpful in terms of understanding the process. So sourdough is a bit peculiar in that there's only 3 ingredients, and there's technically not much to it in that regard, but there's a whole lot to it in terms of method and technique, and obviously requires a lot of patience. There are some fantastic videos on YouTube. I don't think this will be as good as most of them, but this will teach you other things that you might not have seen or known, or things that I have discovered or learned in other sources or places. So, goal, method. I have already put together some of the materials because there's really not a lot to it, and frankly, we will put in a screen grab of the ingredients with the measurements and so forth, so you don't need to write that down or memorize it at this moment. But without a kitchen scale, I don't think you're going much of anywhere. You really have to have that. It's not enough to use cups because flour can be more compacted or less compacted, etc. But we will use this actually just now to measure out the first few ingredients. So this is 600 milliliters of water. I'm zeroing my scale. And I have here the sourdough starter, which with a bit of luck I will be sharing with you so that you can get your game on. You can see that this is very loose and sloppy and has lots of little air bubbles in the top, or maybe you can't see that, but that's what it looks like. So I'm going to pour 120 milliliters, grams in this case, 120 grams of this starter into my 600 milliliters of water. So I'm sort of watching my scale as we go here. At 90, 110, 118, 122, 124. Oh my God. Everything's going to be all right. So that is our sourdough starter and our water. Notice, please, that the sourdough starter is floating, and that's because I fed it twice today. And after this, or maybe before this, depending on how we edit this down, you will see the process of feeding the starter as well. But in a nutshell, you want to be doing that in the hours preceding your bake, or your mixing, I should say. And during the week, if you choose to feed it, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I only feed mine once a week. I hear some people feed theirs every day. That is totally unnecessary and a waste of flour. So moving right along, I've already measured out my flour here, but I'll tell you what's in here because that's relevant. Really, all you need is 800 grams of flour and you're good to go. So once again, you'd put your bowl in here, you'd pour in your 800 grams of flour and you're done. But I wanted to tell you that I actually use 2 different kinds of flour. You could use just King Arthur's. This is the non-organic, unbleached bread flour, which is pretty much available in any supermarket except for during plague quarantines. I use about 350 to 400 grams of this, and about another, bringing it up to 800, another 450 or 400 to 450 grams of this. This stands for French Broad Food Co-op. That's where you can buy this. And this is Carolina Ground, which is probably written on there somewhere. But anyway, Carolina Ground makes 10 different kinds of flour. This is their number 75 bread flour. So if you don't know anything about Carolina Ground, you should. There's a woman named Jennifer Lapidus, an old friend of ours, who used to run Natural Bridge Bakery. When she had been baking for, 15 years or more, and she was sort of burned out on it, she started this mill. She actually sort of connects to farmers in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and so on, and works with them to create strains of wheat that are more sustainable than what a lot of garbage wheats are made out of, that are higher quality, and in many cases are like archival wheats or wheats from ancient grains and so forth. She mills them here in Asheville and then distributes them, I think, to only one store. That's the French Broad Food Co-op, which is where I buy this in 25-pound bags. However, you can also buy it in bins. Once again, virus moment that it is, those things are actually all out of stock. But shortly, they will be available again. So you can buy it in bulk, you can buy it in bags, whatever. You can actually get flowers from Carolina Ground as well, but they have to be ordered online and they have to mail them because of legal issues and logistical matters. You can't actually go there and pick flour up. It's really just a mill in the sort of industrial sense. So the only other ingredient, as I promised, flour, water, and salt, is the salt. You're not meant to use iodized salt, so this is non-iodized salt, but I will also recommend that you not use sea salt because I've tried it and it tends to clump, which does not make your life any easier. So I have already measured out 17 grams of of salt rather. So there are 17 grams of salt sitting in that little scoop there, and we will be using that later, but not at the moment. It is generally recommended that you not mix the salt directly into the flour mixture because salt is hydrophilic, I believe it is, which means it's water loving and it will steal water from your flour. Your first step here is wanting this flour to hydrate. So the salt will be used later, and I have another tip you will later learn which will help prevent sticking to your bowl. So here we are, like so. And I do like this bowl that I've got here. I don't think you need to buy a special bowl just to make bread, but this one has a rubber bottom, so you can see it does not want to slide. You kind of see rubber bottom there a little bit. It's orange, and that just makes your life a little easier if you're not trying to chase your bowl around the floor. This might be one of those areas where we speed up the camera film a little bit so you don't have to watch some schmo mixing flour unless he's doing something interesting like a little dance. So once you've mixed this, as I'm now about to finish doing, you have what is called a shaggy mass. Insert jokes here. And the shaggy mass is basically just the water and the flour, which is kind of a sticky mess like this. And it's really too sticky and too clay-like at this stage for you to be kneading it. And in the rest of this video, I will use the expression stretch and fold because that seems to be the modern current euphemism for kneading. But essentially, over the next 15 or whatever it is hours, we will be periodically working the dough. And stretching and folding is sort of the language du jour about that. And so I've got this to a point now where it's mostly blended. There's not too many lumps of flour in it. I mean, there's always going to be a few, but it's basically in a place where it can be set down for a while so that it can hydrate and begin to allow that sourdough culture to mix more thoroughly through the dough. So it looks like so at the moment. We will let this sit at room temperature, which at the moment is somewhere just north of 70 degrees. It's a rather cold day actually for this April. One word of warning, you want to clean these things up rather quickly because when this mixture solidifies, it becomes something close to alabaster. I have some of these cheapo silicone covers that I like that I just sort of leave it like so. After you have just mixed your basic ingredients, you will have depleted your sourdough starter a little bit, and there's no better time to add to it. So you take your container with whatever starter you have left, which in this case is about half of one of these Asian takeout containers, and you will just take a bit of flour. I would estimate that to be about 30 or 40 grams. As it turns out, it was 26. And then add an equal amount of water. So I'll bring it up to about 50. I love small, easy to control pouring devices. This one happens to be Japanese. So I am at 42, 45, 48, 51, 52. Close enough. So equal amounts of flour and water are in here. And I just give it a little stir until you can tell all of the ingredients are mixed. And the texture will be much, much wetter than what I was showing you with our dough there a moment ago. So it's very liquidy by comparison, and that's okay. At the time that you first blend it, it will only take up, a fraction of the container, or it should only take up a fraction of the container. But be warned that it will grow. It will double or more in size. So this container I will then cover up with its lid like so and put in the fridge until I need it again. The other thing I wanted to show and recommend is that once you have finished mixing your basic ingredients into your shaggy mass and it's just sort of sitting in the bowl waiting for bacteria to run its course, because flour and water, when they harden, they become really hard and really hard to clean. One thing I sometimes do at this stage is sort of take a rubber scraper and kind of go around the inside of the bowl, which I have already done. And then I'll take just a very small amount of either vegetable oil or canola oil, this happens to be olive oil, and just drip just a little bit of it, a very fine pourer so it doesn't put out a lot of liquid, around the inside of the bowl like so. Because otherwise cleaning this bowl is kind of a monster, because that flour and water mix really hardens and becomes kind of disastrous. Similarly, each time you handle the dough, it's good to put a bit of water on your hands first, as I will show later. Even after you wash your hands, if you have any hair at all on your hands, you'll find that later you find there is flour and water. So it's good to have a dedicated towel that you don't use for other things, because after you wash your hands and then you dry them on this towel, I use this one because it has the same color as dough, so you can't tell how much stuff is in it. You're not going to want to use that towel for really anything else, because it's going to have all these little hard things in it that bear resemblance to things you don't want around your food. Through the magic of video editing, we will turn it from 10 minutes to 1 hour and 10 minutes like this. Oh, an hour and a half passed like it was nothing. So we have here our dough that has been resting for an hour and a half, plus or minus. And this is a rubber scraper that comes free with certain bannetons on Amazon. I had it soaking in water because at this point the dough is exceptionally sticky. So I dip my hands in water, I dip the rubber scraper in water, I dip everything in water because it's dying to stick to everything. So I give it a good once over, loosen it up, do it for video, and we've got the majority of it there. Notice in the next few segments the texture of the dough. Right now it's exceptionally elastic but not very tumescent, which is to say it doesn't have a lot of air in it. So it's sort of gooey, you might say, but not particularly buoyant. It doesn't have a lot of air in it, so it seems a little flat. It's gooey like chewing gum, but not inflated like a marshmallow. And that's important because understanding the feeling of the dough in this way will really help you kind of gauge where you're at in your process. So you'll notice I'm using one of these scrapers, kind of a little $5 tool that again you can get in probably either a local a kitchen and company local store, or you can order them on Amazon. At this stage it's pretty important to keep it wet though, so that it doesn't stick to the dough or vice versa. Alright, so like so. So that's about it. The dough's been mixed, and I'll drop that in there like so, and then not as released as we might have hoped. All right, so now we've got it in a state that it will release. Now we set it to rest again. 1:44. See you in 30 to 40 minutes. As you can see from the clock behind me, we flash forward another 45 minutes or so. And I'm going to do another stretch and fold here, and I'd like you to observe the texture of the material. It's getting a little more tumescent, a little more marshmallow-like, and we don't have sticking problems because of the salt trick that I'm about to share with you. We have the dough now getting a little gooier and bouncier than previously. And depending on how the editing all works out, you may not have seen this party trick before, but this is the 17 gram, or some fraction of the 17 grams of salt that we were working with before at Never Drink and Bake. And if you spread it equally around inside of the bowl there, then you will reduce sticking considerably, and so it'll make it a whole lot easier to get out next round. Another recommendation about working with dough and countertops, it's kind of handy to have an additional scraper on hand for when this one is dirty and or gooey or being used for bread making. This one can be used to sort of keep the countertop clean, again, because as this dough dries and becomes ridiculously hard, it's very hard to clean. So kind of staying on top of that helps. Just had a great idea. Given how liquidy this mixture has become at the moment, I think it's the right time to retard it, which in this context means to put it into the fridge. So at whatever hour it is now, 9-ish, 8, 9 o'clock, we're going to break for the evening, and we'll catch up with you in the morning. Hey, good morning. So it's the next day, and sorry about this. Our makeup person doesn't come until 9:30. There's about 14 hours on the clock, which should tell you something about where we are in our process, and this bundle of joy has been sleeping in the refrigerator overnight. So why don't we release it from its slumber and see what it has to offer us here. So if you line your bowl with salt, as I often do, you might want to also scrape out the salty liquid that is in the bowl, which is what kept it from sticking to the bowl in the first place. All right, so I'm really just doing a little bit of mixing while I'm moving this around. Generally, the dough starts out a little bit liquidy when you first start doing your stretch and folds, and by the time you're done, it's firmed up a bit. And part of this is about moving the sourdough materials themselves sort of deeper within the dough. All right, so it's starting to firm up a little bit now. I'm going to suggest that we get it into the bowl one more time. I haven't used up all of my salt yet. This is the last of the salt, which I'm now lining the bowl with. And this will be sort of our last session within the bowl. And in about 30 to 45 minutes or so, we'll break this out again, divide it, and then drop it into bannetons. See you then. Hey, so we're back, and you can see that it's only a short time since our last transmission. So I'm about to divide this into two balls, or boules as the French would say, and then put them into the bannetons. And I would say that the shaping of this and the prepping and putting them into the bannetons is a little more difficult than what has been done previously, which is really just sort of slopping dough around. It doesn't really take a whole lot of practice. So I'll try to be clear and concise about what's going on here. So this is the last time we'll need our scraper, because the dough will not be returning to this container. It shall reside henceforth in the scullery, which is conveniently close. So I'm going to give this one last kneading or stretch and folding to evenly distribute the salt, as well as do what they call degassing, which, as the name would imply, is about trying to get some of the bubbles out of it. When the large bubbles are left in the dough for too long, they create what they call mouse houses, which is when you cut into a artisanal loaf of bread and there's like a gigantic hole that a mouse could live in there. That's not generally considered a very desirable thing, because well, your butter falls off for one thing. But some holes are good, but lots of holes are not necessarily so good. So the process of getting the larger bubbles out of the dough is referred to as degassing, and it will kind of depend on your flow, as in the timing of what you've done and how healthy your starter mixture was, and these kinds of things, as to what degree degassing will really be required. So you'll see that I'm kind of squishing out a few little lumps in here that are bits of flour, and dividing this into roughly 2 equal pieces of dough, approximately anyway, something like that. And so now you're looking to create a sort of an evenness, and what I mean by that is you want to do what we call shaping. But what I am trying to do now is kind of roll all of the edges down into the middle. So at this point you can see it's still sort of uneven, and there's kind of a protrusion here. So this one, I'm going to move over here for a second and kind of do a similar thing, but hopefully a little more effectively. So I've grabbed 2 ends here and pulled them apart, fold them in the middle like a little basket, and I'm going to do the same here. So you can see now I've got a slightly more even distribution, but I'm not done yet. But this is all under the general banner of shaping, and basically you keep going with it until you get what you want, and that will depend on your skill, how the dough's texture is, etc., etc. So once again, I'm kind of rolling my edges back inside and looking for a somewhat consistent sort of a shape. And this one I feel like I'm getting pretty close, so I flipped it over again. I'm going to do another set of kind of stretch and folds here to roll my edges under, and I can sense now that I'm getting pretty close to what I want, despite the lack of precision in this particular case. So the last step, as far as the shaping is concerned, is done dry, not wet. So up until now, you'll see that I've been dipping my scraper in water a lot and trying to keep my hands wet so that it doesn't stick to the dough. We are now going to put that behind us and move into a new phase where we're going to start working dry, and I think the reason for that may become clear, but we'll see. So in working dry, I'm going to be using this, which is brown rice flour, which I get from, again, the French Broad Food Co-op, which they sell in bulk. And I just have an ordinary sort of a baby sifter here, and I pour a certain amount of that rice flour into the sifter. And from here on out, I'll be working dry, which will make things kind of a different texture. Frankly, since I've been adding water all along by keeping my hands wet and keeping the scraper wet, this will sort of reverse that out a little bit, in the sense of now you're adding something dry to compensate for what you have added, which was previously wetter. And a word or two about brown rice flour and its sort of role in this. You're basically looking for a kind of powdery substance that does not absorb water. So brown rice flour, grits, cornmeal, although it's a bit coarse,
All of these things are used in this context because they don't absorb water, so they don't become sticky and pasty. They're more like little baby ball bearings that help you sort of insulate yourself from the medium. So I'm now pushing a little of that brown rice flour underneath, and look what's going on here as I, oh, this is really sticky, as I sort of push and roll a little bit. And this is something that, you know, everybody has their own sort of little style, and you'll sort of develop your own, but if you see somebody doing it with a, you know, a little bit of finesse that you like, you can give that method a try. So I'm sort of rolling under and pushing the edges down under, and you'll see that that's stretching the top. And look at how dramatically it changes in just a couple of moves. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Wow, this is wet. All right. So once again, within just a couple of short moves there, we've gone from this sort of slobbering mess that looks like the blob to something that looks sort of like a respectable, you know, baby's bun or something. There's going to be a little bit of detritus on your hands from all of this fussing, but not to worry. So I'm intentionally pausing now to leave these guys to sort of rest, and depending on how observant you are, you may actually see them sort of relax a bit, and that's okay. That's kind of what we're after, because one of the things that's happening when you let dough rest, whether it be in that bowl or on the countertop, is when you have like stretched it apart and then folded it over, immediately those folded edges aren't actually bonding back to the bread. In other words, you could kind of take it apart again, like you folded a shirt and then you take the shirt back apart again, but particularly if it's got that salty water in it. But after it's set for a while, and that could be anything from 20 or 30 seconds to several minutes, those edges bond again, and that becomes one unified lump that can then be re-stretched or refolded or, you know, whatever. So it is intentional that I'm sort of taking a moment here to, to damage the bread. To pause, to give these a moment to sort of relax, and also give all of those edges that I just sort of pushed underneath there a moment to sort of bond and adhere to the underside. So now I'm going to prep the bannetons. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to need a tad more flour here. So again, this is brown rice flour. So I'm just going to throw in a little bit of powder there into the banneton to sort of evenly coat the edges so I can get an easy release, insert joke here, and getting them into the pots that I'll ultimately be cooking them in. So that's a little view of that with the dusting. Similar dusting gonna go on here. It would be hard for me to quantify the amount of powder I'm tossing in here, but I'd put it at about a tablespoon, maybe a slightly rounded tablespoon in terms of volume. And it's kind of an inexacting science, but if your dough is really sticking to the banneton, you can't get it out, that wasn't enough. And a word about bannetons. I would say this: if you're going to do any baking for the rest of your life and you have the room to store these things, get a couple of bannetons. They're like $5, and they really add a nice texture and shape to the dough, as well as giving you somewhere to store it that's perfectly even and just the right size for your cooking container. In this case, pots, and I use a clay pot and a Dutch oven, as I will show you in a moment. So now, similarly, I've thrown, I don't know, a tablespoon and a half, maybe. It's not really a very exacting science. I'm just throwing some white sesame seeds in here, like so. I get these in large bags from my wife, actually. I don't know where she gets them. Where do you get them? Asian store. Go to an Asian store. Great deal on white sesame seeds. Come in large bags. So I'm going to give one more little nip and tuck here to my little dough balls, in the interest of, notice how they're getting almost sphere-like. That's kind of what we're shooting for. And I'm continuing to sort of roll the underside under, which is sort of stretching the outer skin, so much so that you can actually see, in some cases, little bubbles that are sort of coming forth, which I don't necessarily try to break unless they're really large, and if they are, you can just sort of pat them down like so and break them up. or you can stab them like so. But unless there's a lot of them and they're really large, I'd say consider them a good thing. That indicates that you've got some good fermentation going on there. All right, so we're about the spot now, and you can see some little, I think depending on how good the video is, you can see some little bubbles piercing forth there. That's a good thing. As long as there's not too many of them, they're not too enormous. I would say that's desirable. The reason I'm wiping my hands on the table here periodically is to sort of get a little more dust on my hands. So I'm going to drop these bad boys into the bannetons. Notice I'm putting them upside down, so that's the underside. Those are all the little bits and pieces that I had rolled under. All right. That's the underside. So looks all right, but it doesn't really matter because that's going to be the bottom of the loaf. So I think that's about right. I have a few more of these silicone covers which keep moisture in, and like so. And then these are going to head into the fridge for a undetermined period of time. But in general, I just put them in the fridge until I have time to deal with them. That might be an hour, it might be 3 hours, it might be 5 hours. Today I think it'll probably be like 6 or 7 hours, and we'll probably bake sometime this evening. When they're in the fridge, they're doing relatively little, meaning they're not growing too much, they're not expanding too much. They're in a holding pattern. They're being retarded quite literally. And that's a good thing. That means that you can, choose to go about your life until you have time to deal with the baking process. It is said by people who are far more into the chemistry of this than I am, that when you have your bread out on the table at room temperature, you are developing acetic acid, which is sort of in the vinegar flavor as far as like flavor profile. If they are in the fridge, they are developing lactic acid, which is more like the flavor of yogurt. I personally have been in a bread symposium where I got to taste uncooked bread dough from both of these environments, and I could really tell the difference. So that's the theory behind the practice. Ultimately, what matters is your convenience in your baking process and that your bread tastes good. So we're going into the ovens, into the fridges. So at this point in the video, you may be thinking that this video is quite a bit like sourdough bread making, in the sense that you get to this point where you think, is this ever going to end? And yes, it's about to end. As you can see from our clock here, we're right at the 24-hour mark. And I wanted to give you a little preview of what's about to happen, because I'm not sure how much time I will have to eloquently explain my process when I'm dropping the loaves from the bannetons into the 500-degree pots. It's a bit of a delicate act. And although none of this is difficult, I would say, by any stretch, this is certainly the stage that takes the most practice to ace it. So I'm going to give you a little overview of what I'm about to do, and then I'm going to do it with minimal chatter. So these bannetons have just been pulled out of the refrigerator. And the reason we want them reasonably cold is because that is to maximize oven spring. Oven spring is how big the loaf gets while baking. The bigger the better. That is always the goal when making decisions at this stage. So the colder the loaf is, the theory goes, the longer before the crust hardens, because once the crust hardens, that's it. It's not going to be expanding anymore after that. So prior to starting the video, I preheated the oven to 500 degrees, and the pans are now in there. They are both hot. And a little tip about that: you can get away with preheating the oven and the pans themselves to 425 or 500. But if the pans are any cooler than that at the moment that you throw the dough in, they're probably these are going to stick. And getting them unstuck can damage them or destroy them. So I generally set it for 450, and when it beeps, I pull the pans out and I throw the dough in, then put them in and set it to
we're at 500 degrees and set it for 500 degrees. So the bake time is going to be 500 degrees for 17 minutes covered, and then an additional 13 or 14 minutes uncovered. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to pull these pots out. You're going to notice that they're very different. One is a enameled cast iron pan, which is easily available either locally like Kitchen & Company or Williams-Sonoma if you've got a few extra dollars to spend, or from Amazon. It's an indestructible pan, which is very good. It's got a great shaped handle that's very easy to grab, which is important because you're going to be using big Muppet-like gloves. The only downside, I would argue, is that the shape is a very square bottom, so the loaf doesn't look as dramatic and as beautiful. The other one you will see is ceramic, and the lid I will be using on that does not match because I've broken two of them because, again, when a pan is, or a lid is 500 degrees, you really have to be very careful, and I've dropped them several times. However, the beauty of the ceramic pan, or bowl rather, is that it is rounded at the bottom, so it creates a beautifully shaped loaf, if that matters to you. So, other points. This is white sesame seeds that I also used earlier, sprinkled into the bottom of the bannetons. I sprinkle a little bit of them into the bottom of the pans because that reduces sticking a little bit and looks nice. And this is called a lamb, spelled L-A-M-E, like lame, so insert lame joke here. These are used for scoring the loaves once they are in the pans. And what that does is it gives the inside of the dough opportunity to rise and expand. If it weren't scored soon enough, the crust would become hard and it would limit the expansion. It also looks nice. This is a bit of an art. You don't need to buy one of these, although they're only like $5 from Amazon, but you can just use a razor blade, a straight edge, anything that's really sharp. And it'll take a little practice. You don't want to go gently and kind of tug at it because it'll stick. You have to move with confidence. And people do, fancy patterns. I just do an X. Do whatever you like. Last but not least, if you have like a mister or a sprayer, I would strongly encourage you to spray the loaves right before you put the lids on. We have one that we use for cleaning, which happens to be electric and have a pump in it, so that just makes it easier and faster. You will see me use that right before I put the lids on. So I think that's it. Sesame seeds into the hot pans. Make sure that the loaf is released, which it is, and then try your best to nail it. Try it one more time. I'm going to score it. And again. And I'm going to show it to the camera and then put the lids on. Ta-da! Dun-dun. Now these are going in. And they're going to be cooked or baked for 17 minutes. With lids on. We will touch base with you. 17 start. We will touch base again when we pull the lids off to show you how anemically albino they are. And then again, of course, at the end when we have our celebratory toast or bite or whatever. So, this is it. The big moment. Well, the second biggest moment anyway. It is time to pull the lids off the pots. So we're now setting the oven for 450. And setting the timer for 14 minutes. So I'm now turning the oven off, turning the timer off, and I'm going to leave the oven door open just a little bit to allow it to cool down. There is loaf number 1 looks a bit like Frankenstein's head. There's loaf number 2, very attractive and very nice. So I'm just going to leave it cracked like that, and that's going to allow the loaves to cool down. The idea being that if you leave them in there and cooling down for 2 or 3 minutes, they will release from the pan more easily, or at least that has been my experience. So, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. We're now at 24 hours and 23 minutes. With a little luck, they drop right out, and we have a malshapen loaf here that looks like Frankenstein's head, and we have a very pretty UFO-like loaf that is attractive, although not quite as much oven spring as one might like, but not too bad. So as you can see, I've got these on cooling racks, which keeps them from sweating on the bottom. And it's a good idea to allow them to cool for an hour before you cut into them, because there's a lot of moisture inside that you want to keep inside. And if you cut it open early, why am I talking with Muppet gloves? And if you cut it open early, you're going to lose a lot of that. So practice a little self-restraint and give them an hour to cool. So we will tune back in at 1:24 for a ritual consuming. As you can see, it's been 26 hours since we started making this bread, which could reasonably lead one to ask, why not just go to McDonald's? You can have that food in 26 minutes, and you can. But you won't be getting this. So if there's one thing that no self-respecting bread video should do, it's tell you how to eat your bread. So I figured I would do that. I think that the best way to really appreciate this kind of bread is to tear it. So I sometimes make a couple of slices and completely destroy my loaf, and then pull from the middle there. Can you tell I've been drinking? This sort of thing. Because when you tear it, you get a better sense of its texture and I don't know about flavor, but we can imagine. Wow. When you make this bread and it's fresh out of the oven, it doesn't need olive oil or butter or anything. It's marvelous just the way it is. But after it's been sitting around for a day or two, it's best when it's toasted. Now, I recommend that you buy some parchment paper if you're going to be doing this with any frequency, because if you keep this bread out on the counter, obviously it's going to dry out, the crust is going to get very hard, and you're going to break filling. And if you keep it in a plastic bag, it's going to get kind of soft all over in a way that's maybe not as crispy and fresh as you'd like it to be. But if you wrap it in parchment paper and then put it in an unsealed Ziploc bag, you heard that right, unsealed, you'll have just kind of the right balance of dry crispiness on the crust with moisture on the inside. So you thought it couldn't be done. You didn't think your eating of bread could be micromanaged, but here we are. So that concludes our obsessively drilled down, detailed look into the baking of sourdough bread. And I'd like to thank my wife, Lisa, who's done all the editing, sound and otherwise, in this video. And she's made this possible. Love you, honey. Bye, everybody. Enjoy your bread. It's good for you, really. Don't believe all that stuff about carbs. Try. Just try. You want to do it retake? Ah! All right. You want to put that in after my first bite?